and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The Alhambra Theater and Dining, looking for a holiday gift? Offering Black Friday packages Friday, November 29th. Shows include West Side Story, Beautiful, the Carole King musical, and more. Info at alhambrajacks.com or 641-1212.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, the velvet rope economy. We talked to economist Peter Atwater about why post-pandemic recovery looks so different for different people. Then, how one Jacksonville man is using social media to cross the city's cultural and political divide. And from bluegrass to newgrass to folk, we talked to a singer-songwriter who does it all ahead of his Saturday performance in St. Augustine. Join the conversation. Give us a call on air at 904-549-2937 or head to firstcoastconnect.org and discover all the ways you can connect with us. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. The Labor Department says U.S. employers added 119,000 jobs in September. That's more than expected. But job growth in the summer was weaker than first reported. NPR's Scott Horsley says the new numbers were delayed by the 6-week government shutdown.
The report shows hiring was uneven in September. Healthcare and hospitality continued to add workers, but factories and construction companies shed jobs. The unemployment rate inched up to 4.4%, while the workforce grew. Job gains for the 2 previous months were revised down by a total of 33,000 jobs. While the information in today's release is somewhat stale, it's the last jobs report the Federal Reserve will get before its next decision in December on interest rates. Snapshots of the October and November job market have been delayed by the government shutdown. Some of the October figures, including the unemployment rate, were not gathered at all. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
A trade group representing major airlines is urging Congress to permanently stop flight disruptions during government shutdowns. NPR's Joel Rose reports.
The head of Airlines for America, Chris Sununu, told the Senate Aviation Subcommittee that airlines support a bill that would ensure that air traffic controllers get paid during future government shutdowns.
We need solutions like this to be implemented to shield the FAA and its workforce from the politics of a shutdown.
The FAA says it was forced to reduce the number of flights at major airports because of staffing shortages of air traffic controllers who were required to work without pay. Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth urged regulators to release the data behind that decision, suggesting the Trump administration may have weaponized the aviation system to score political points during the shutdown. Joel Rose, NPR News, Washington.
Army Secretary Dan Driscoll is in Ukraine, along with Army Chief of Staff General Randy George. NPR's Tom Bowman reports.
Driscoll and General George had already planned a trip to Ukraine to talk about drone technology and lessons learned from the Ukrainian battlefield. Then the White House last week asked the Army delegation to also help kickstart peace negotiations with Trump envoy Steve Witkoff. A U.S. official tells NPR. The official was not authorized to speak publicly. Since Driscoll is an Army combat veteran, the sense was this delegation could more easily relate to the Ukrainian officers. The news of their trip comes amid reports of a new U.S.-Russia peace plan that calls for Ukraine to give up the rest of the Donbas area to Russia and also accept a smaller army. NPR has not confirmed the plan, first reported by the Financial Times. Tom Bowman, NPR News.
News reports in France say French authorities are looking into comments made by the Grok chatbot on the platform X. The chatbot made statements in French denying the Holocaust. The post was deleted after it was challenged by the Auschwitz Museum. The X platform then said the statement was fake. You're listening to NPR.
Good morning. You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Stephen Ponson. It is now 9:04. Local police are debunking online rumors that a serial killer may be on the loose in Jacksonville after 3 women were recently killed. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office posted on Facebook that rumors of a serial killer are false. Detectives are investigating the homicide cases separately. The first death was a woman found Saturday in a business parking lot on Sunbeam Road. Then on Monday, a woman was found dead under a bridge on Blanding Boulevard. Also on Monday, a woman was found dead inside a Phoenix neighborhood home just east of Springfield. JSO encourages anyone with information about any of the 3 deaths to contact them or First Coast Crime Stoppers. Here's something that will excite the lexophiles and linguophiles among us. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians has unveiled a new online language resource. The Choctaw Dictionary Project is a digital tool that's designed for language learners of all levels. The glossary not only has more than 5,000 words, but it also includes recorded and translated stories and histories. The dictionary's creators say that before this project, no one had documented the language of the descendants of the Mississippi Choctaw who resisted removal in the 1830s. It'll be dry and warm again today here in northeast Florida. Temperatures will eventually reach the upper 70s for areas along the coast, low to mid 80s for inland areas. Winds will shift from the east this afternoon, bringing in some more moisture, which will increase the chances for fog later tonight and during the early morning hours tomorrow.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include MS Now, home to The Rachel Maddow Show, Morning Joe, The Briefing with Jen Psaki, and more. MS Now is a source for news, opinion, and the world. Learn more at ms.now. This is NPR.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, the power of confidence to drive everything from financial decisions to social revolution. We talked to behavioral economist and educator Peter Atwater about the power of certainty and control. Later in the program, a Jacksonville man builds a cultural comprehension, one Instagram follower at a time. But first, perceptions of the nation's economic health range dramatically, from those enjoying concierge health care to those experiencing car repossessions. The difference is something my guest has dubbed the K-shaped economy. Peter Atwater is a professor of economics at the College of William and Mary and author of The Confidence Map, Charting a Path from Chaos to Clarity. He joins us now via video. Peter Atwater, thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here, Ann. Thank you.
So, Peter, your book is built around the idea that confidence shapes how we think and behave, and not just in an economic sense, but personally as human beings. Can you kind of break down the confidence map for us?
Sure. So I've been teaching a class on confidence for almost a decade. And one of the things that I discovered early on is that I really didn't know what confidence was. And ultimately, I concluded that to feel confident, we need to feel that the future ahead is predictable, that there's a sense of certainty to what lies ahead of us, and also that we have a sense of control. It's comforting to know that the road ahead may be straight, but if we don't know how to drive the car, we're going to struggle behind the wheel. And so from that, I developed a very simple 2x2 box chart that positions certainty on the x-axis, control on the y-axis. And what I find is that when we have both certainty and control, that's the upper right box, I call that the comfort zone. We're relaxed, things are easy. When I talk to athletes and they talk about being in the zone, that's exactly where they are. Things feel certain and they feel very much in control. The opposite experience, the lower left-hand box, is what I call the stress center. Because anytime we experience anxiety, it's because we don't have certainty or control in what matters to us. And if I think about traumatic events, every one of them exists in the lower left-hand corner. Mm. From that, though, there's some interesting hybrid boxes. The lower right-hand box is where we have certainty but no control, I think of that as the passenger seat on an airplane. And that's an environment that is inherently fragile. If you've ever experienced turbulence, you know what that feeling is when suddenly everyone around you is nervous. And then the other box is what I call the launch pad, where we have control but no certainty. And that's where every financial decision in our life is made, by borrowing, lending, investing. And so with each of these boxes comes different feelings, emotions, stories, preferences. Our world is turned upside down depending on where we are on this box chart.
And so, Peter, this has helped you describe where we make some financial decisions from, perhaps better places than others to make a financial decision from. But it's also something that you have found helpful for your students and for people also just trying to understand human behavior. I understand that you used this map at a conference at one time and asked people there who were educators to chart their own place on the graph and then their students. Can you kind of tell us what happened at that event and what you took from it?
Yeah, what was so striking to me, I knew that those in education would be largely in the stress center, and they were. But it was striking to me to see that they put their students not in the launch pad, not in the comfort zone, but largely in the passenger seat or the stress center. And so there's this sense that this generation doesn't feel like they have a sense of control, that they've been raised to be safe. Many of them see uncertainty as the equivalent of not being safe. They're also very compliant. And so I think, particularly for educators, we need to find ways to generate opportunities for experiential learning rather than just classroom learning. It's great if I can teach you to ski in the classroom, but ultimately you need to get on the ski slopes.
So this generational attribute, it has something to do perhaps with, whether this generation has been given opportunities to strike out on their own or perhaps, take advantage of certain ways of operating in the world. But it can also kind of change how they think about politics. It can also change how they interact societally. It's not just about kind of workplace or economic decisions. How does it? What's the interplay there for how we think about conformity or just our sense of our place in the world?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of followership, and followership exists in that passenger seat environment. And followership is probably the easiest response we have to stress. It's not fight or flight. It's literally just get in line behind someone. And so we need to appreciate that this generation, this younger generation, has spent and continues to spend a lot of time following. And I don't think it's coincidental that followership is one of the key measuring sticks for social media. That what makes an influencer is the crowd that they draw behind us. And one of the things I know is that when confidence is low, we're not great at choosing who we follow.
So in terms of powerful personalities or people on social media or people in the political realm, who gains advantage in a circumstance like that?
The powerful personality, the one who can draw a crowd, gains immense power. And so we see that every day, whether it's in politics or in entertainment, in sports, where the success is now measured by the size of the crowd that an individual can draw. And I think those that are in the crowd need to step back and to say, does this individual seek to empower me or to keep me in a perpetual state of followership? And I think that if I look at the characteristic of many of our prominent leaders today, it's far more about sustaining followership than it is what I would consider noble leadership in terms of encouraging others to take risk, to move forward, and really empowering them to become the leaders of the future.
And so if we're looking kind of below that center point where people are either on the kind of on the right-hand side in the passenger seat or in the stress center on that lower left side where you say, a lot of basically all of our traumatic experiences happen where there is a lot of anxiety. What do we know about people making decisions from that standpoint? And also in terms of how that shapes how they view the rest of the world?
Sure. So what we see in that environment is a lot of what I call me here now thinking, that I'm very much focused on myself rather than empathetic or concerned about others. I'm also likely to withdraw from social gatherings that involve other people. I seek out those who are only familiar to me, and I'm either frightened or I ignore those with many differences. I'm also focused on right here, and that makes it difficult in terms of our willingness to travel or to explore the world. Exploration requires us to be willing to jump into the launch pad. And then the last element is sort of our time preference. Everything needs to be immediate. And particularly in our decision making, we don't pay attention to the long-term consequences of our choices. What we care about is relief for right now. And we see a lot of this short-term decision making by people, particularly in the stress center, that doesn't take into consideration consequences. And so that me here now mindset is highly impulsive, very emotional, and leads us to a lot of knee-jerk responses to what matters just right now.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to behavioral economist and educator Peter Atwater about the power of certainty and control. You can join the conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways that you can connect with us. Peter, I want to shift gears a little bit because this is a term that you coined called the K-shaped recovery. Can you explain what that is, what it looks like?
So in March of 2020, just moments after the pandemic hit, I noticed a striking contrast in confidence between white collar workers and blue collar workers. That those who could pivot immediately to working from home, their feelings of certainty and control immediately rose. They were getting paychecks. Life was inconvenient, but it went on with a dramatic similarity to what had existed prior to COVID. On the other hand, blue collar workers were really struggling. Many lost their jobs. Those that didn't were operating in very stressful environments, hospital workers, supermarket clerks, delivery people. And so what I immediately felt was that the path out of COVID was going to be very different if you were at the top of the economy or at the bottom of the economy. A couple of weeks later, there was this land grab by economists for letters. And the focus was, what shape would the recovery be? Some said it would be V-shaped, where everybody would do better. Others said it would be U-shaped. Yes, we'd get there, but it would take a while. But ultimately, I looked at that and said, no, it's going to be a K-shape, that those at the top are rebounding quickly. The economy that supports them will recover. Meanwhile, those at the bottom will continue to struggle. And now 5 years later, that contrast between those at the top and the bottom is incredibly pronounced. It's hard not to see that there is a world of difference if you are on the arm of the K versus on the leg of the K.
And so, traditionally we have thought of people living at the extremes as sort of the haves versus the have-nots. You no longer think that that's an accurate frame. Can you explain what it is that you're thinking?
Yeah, I think we've reached the point where we have it alls and those that have none, that those at the bottom increasingly have nothing to lose. But I also think in terms of economic terms, that our economy now looks like a Jenga tower that's very top heavy, where almost all of the growth is at the very top, whether it's a function of AI or the stock market, that is an ecosystem unto itself. And then below it, it feels like the blocks are being pulled out of the Jenga tower. As you mentioned, we have high rates of default on used car loans. Those at the bottom are struggling in terms of affordability. And so I'm deeply troubled by this divide, not just economically, but in terms of the fact that we have an America that is a small group of people who feel invulnerable amid a growing sea of despair.
And so if you have people with sort of nothing to lose, what does that do to the social fabric? What does that do to the political landscape?
We're starting to see what it does to the political landscape. If you look at the mayoral election in New York recently, what that says to me isn't that Americans moved more to the left with their election of Mr. Mamdani, but they moved down. That those at the bottom are looking for relief. And one thing I don't think either one of our established political parties appreciate is that the bottom of our economy is deeply purple, that it's a mix of Republicans and Democrats, and they're increasingly feeling desperate.
The people in that realm and kind of throughout the political column, whether at the top or lower down, seem much more divided side to side. But you believe that there is a uniformity at kind of the lower extreme. Is that still politically divided?
Yeah, I believe that our greatest divide is economic, or confidence between those at the top and the bottom. And I think that those at the bottom have much more in common than the political media would lead us to believe. They struggle with affordability. They struggle with access to healthcare. They struggle with access to education and job training. There's a lot more that they share in terms of their day-to-day vulnerability than we are led to believe. And that's certainly what comes out in the data that I have.
So there is this term that's emerged, this velvet rope economy. Can you explain basically what is meant by that, what that looks like?
So that's a term that was coined by a New York Times writer, Nelson Schwartz, and he wrote a whole book on the topic. But essentially, what we have today are industries that are really catering to those at the top. We see that in our athletic events with all of the boxes and the special seating and the VIP service. We see that on airplanes. And I think it's interesting that Delta Airlines announced recently that they expect next year they're going to make more from the front of the plane than the back of the plane. So we're seeing industry after industry really cater to those at the top and reduce what is available to those at the bottom.
This is an interesting trend. I mean, when you talk about making more from the premium cabin versus, the coach cabin, that has to be taken into the context that there's just many, many more seats that we're talking about in the back of the plane. And so if they're making that much more from the front of the plane, it really is a true divide, not just in sort of the quality of the service, the size of the seat, whether you can bring in a piece of luggage. So people are experiencing the world in a very different way in this kind of economy. Is that right?
Yeah, and those at the top don't see the plight of those at the bottom. They've really distanced themselves. They live in isolated communities. They travel in different ways. I'm beginning to think that the only place we are a true socioeconomic mix anymore is in the emergency room of a hospital. But I think it's important to appreciate that while the bottom may not be visible to the top, those at the bottom are all too aware of the abundance that exists above them at a time when they themselves are experiencing intense scarcity.
Sure, and that's something that we've seen, in revolutions, even in other parts of the world, where the intense luxury that some in the ruling class have experienced, being visible on social media, that is something that people who don't have that experience can see, and it can be a real trigger point.
It can, if I look at the Arab Spring and plot uprisings in the Middle East against food inflation, it becomes very clear that there's a connection between those two. The New England Institute of Complex Systems has a whole series of reports on that. And so we need to be cognizant that the opposite of confidence is vulnerability. And when I feel powerless and uncertain, ultimately that forces a response. And fight and flight get a lot of attention, but there are other ways that we act out that are dangerous societally.
When it comes to this commodification of, public experiences, I mean, we've talked about airlines, but there's also, the Speedy Pass at Disney. There, we mentioned concierge healthcare, which is, very, very inflated costs for really just better quality treatment. And, things like, kind of anything that you can pay for, whether it's, the faster traveling, getting into the TSA. Is there, and I know that you don't love the word unprecedented, but is there a precedent for that sort of basic commodification of everything?
I think you have to go back to the Gilded Age to see this kind of access to premium services for those at the top versus those at the bottom. And that was a similar period of extreme inequality, not just economically, but in terms of how people feel.
And so when you talked about the ultra luxury, there was a fellow at interviewed by the Wall Street Journal who works for a travel group, and he basically said, "Thank God for luxury and ultra luxury. That's what's keeping our business thriving. That is the travel industry, and it is very aspirational. And again, it's something that you see a lot on social media."
It is, and I think we underestimate what a small population it actually involves. Moody's recently reported that the top 10% of Americans represent 50% of spending. And that, I think, is indicative not of a healthy economy, but an economy that is reliant on too few. And I have become very frustrated with policymakers. Those most able to address this issue seem to be unwilling to.
So capitalism, as a form of how our economic system works, is it something that is transparent enough for people to understand how it benefits them, or not? I mean, the stock market, for instance, is going gangbusters, and people who are watching their 401k, jump up by leaps and bounds have a certain sense that is beneficial universally, for them. And at the same time, some of those companies that are doing so well are, chipping away at some of the foundations of our economy, like the workplace, whether that's being automated or, AI is kind of depleting how many people have work. Can you talk about how we perceive economic well-being through the capitalist lens and kind of whether we understand it sufficiently?
We don't understand it sufficiently, and that's one of its greatest risks. It's a very abstract concept, as is AI. And I think of AI anymore as a distant relative to folks on Main Street. They don't quite know what it is, who it is, what it's used for. All they know is that it seems to be benefiting a group of people who themselves, the wealthy, who are very abstract and distant too. And both of these, particularly together, become easy symbols to oppose when you're at the bottom. And that sense that AI is now a threat to my job, capitalism is rewarding other people, but not me. In fact, I'm paying the price of it. And so those, again, become easily unifying themes for a group at the bottom that feels not just threatened, but has a zero-sum mindset where they now feel that others benefited at their expense.
And so it does seem that in the last, couple weeks that the current administration has done a little bit of a shift in terms of how they talk about the economy and our experience of the economy, and perhaps acknowledging the K-shaped recovery. Can you, do you think that that is a lasting change? Do you think that, and whether that is, pulling back on some tariffs on things like coffee and bananas, or just talking about, maybe changing the way that mortgages are structured? Do you think that that is a lasting shift, that this administration is maybe recognizing the different experiences of some people?
I think the steps that have been taken so far are very superficial, symbolic, the easiest, the lowest hanging fruit. But those at the bottom are still wondering about SNAP benefits, about what happens to affordable health care. And in those regards, we are hearing a lot of promises, but we're not seeing action. And those at the bottom, in that me here now mindset, they want steps that are tangible, immediate, and relate to them right now. And I think no matter what side of the aisle you are on, you need to be thinking with that mindset, that the promise of relief 6 months, a year, 2 years from now isn't useful to those at the bottom. They've been waiting for 5 years as the cumulative impact of inflation is making their day-to-day life truly unaffordable.
Do you think that there is, where do you see it? Where do you see this going? This K shape, does it continue? Is there a nadir for the people, experiencing that downward trend? Is there a point at which something happens to shake up the system? What do you see happening?
I think that the ubiquity, the obvious nature of our economy today, that we can refer to it as being K-shaped and people generally nod in agreement, suggests that we may have reached a point where the gap is too wide. And so the question in my mind is, it's reached a point where many people feel that it needs to be addressed. And so the question is, how does it get addressed? Does it get addressed in a thoughtful way by those who are able to do something about it? Or does it get addressed impulsively and emotionally by those at the bottom?
And so where in your graph does that change occur? Which people in what quadrant are motivated to stay in the passenger seat? Are those people motivated to do anything? I mean, we talked about this generational situation in a lot of cases. Who would be motivated to inspire that kind of change?
What we see is that it is easiest for us to move from the passenger seat into the launch pad when we do it with others. That the crowd effect gives us a sense of certainty. It empowers us to move up and to the left, to take risks that we wouldn't otherwise take. And so I think that there is a false sense of compliance that those who are influential today believe is something that can be maintained. Because what I see is that as this group grows and grows more agitated, they're more likely to do something impulsive.
I want to ask a question from one of our listeners on Facebook. He says the airline product has deteriorated as fares have declined. The premium services that the guest laments are a way to offer the kind of comfort that was once standard for people willing to pay for it. Um, there is sort of this, adjacent reality when it comes to commodifying things, is that a lot of times they're asking you to pay for it, whether it's like a bag, right? Something that used to be an included item. So it is not just a perk. Sometimes it's basically just the standard with an additional price.
Yeah, those at the bottom feel nickeled and dimed in any number of areas today where things that used to be included are now, everything feels like an a la carte menu. Meanwhile, they're watching the services above them become grander and grander and more extreme. And so that creates jealousy, it creates antagonism. And so those are the reality that's visible. And that all that visibility is how we frame the reality of our world.
We're talking to behavioral economist Peter Atwater. We have a call from Susan in Fruit Cove. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Good morning. Oh, I'm so glad that you're talking about this. My life has been working with people in poverty and trying to work towards change. And the big answer is the political will. Are we at that place where we can say to all of our leaders, not just in the United States, but globally, that this is important, that everyone have access to food? And it's there, but we have to push. And I can recommend it. Bread for the World is a faith-based organization that has been pushing gently, bipartisanly for years to reduce hunger and eliminate hunger. We can do that, just like we did NASA. There was no money. There was nothing ready to do that, but the political will followed that declaration.
Thank you, Susan. Your thoughts, Peter?
I think we live in a time where so many of our political leaders are more political reactionaries, that they're crowd following, that they're looking at polls, they're looking at, the voter sentiment for signs that it's safe to act, to be courageous. And so I'm encouraging policymakers on both sides not to wait, because by the time the crowd acts, they will have lost the opportunity to act.
Well, it is something obviously that is of great interest to everyone, the economic reality and the future political reality. Peter Atwater, thank you so much. Appreciate you being here. We have a link to your book on our website. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Up next, a Jacksonville content creator trying to bridge the city's cultural and political divide with curiosity and empathy. Welcome back. Well, it's hard to believe we are just about 1 week away from Thanksgiving, and there's nothing like fighting with loved ones over politics and long nursed grudges to kind of reinforce the challenge that lays ahead. But my next guest encourages a different path. Here to talk about approaching difference with curiosity is John Filson, a content creator and social media bridge builder here in Jacksonville. John, nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ann.
So tell us a little bit about, first of all, what your social media profile is for people who aren't interested. We're going to show some clips for people watching on our live stream, but what does it look like? What are you doing?
I'm basically documenting my own journey, my learning journey, being curious and empathetic about others who are different from me. So, for example, I have a little bit of background in Iraq as a relief worker years ago during the war, and so I've posted a lot of things about Iraqi culture versus American culture. Since moving to Jacksonville a few years ago, I've been discovering for my own self, being new to the South, being new to all sorts of history here, the experiences of Black Americans in local history here.
Mm-hmm.
And so it looks like me exploring, talking to people, trying to do it with humor and a little bit of fun, because crossing social and political differences should be fun. And otherwise, it's a wide variety of things.
So I want to play a particular clip that just sort of shows how you maybe try to build a little consensus around ideas of similarity. It has to do with a certain favorite sandwich in the United States. Let's just play a little, and then I'm going to ask you about it.
A delicious snack in Iraq called rashi dibis. Rashi is kind of like peanut butter, but you make it with sesame seeds. And dibis is molasses made out of dates. You eat it with fresh bread, and it's like the Iraqi version of PB&J. It's also a great snack during times of fasting. In fact, I knew a lot of Chaldean and Assyrian Christians who would fast during the morning during Lent and have rashi dibis in the afternoon. I loved it. So much, in fact, that I actually had 2 goldfish when I lived in Iraq, and I named them rashi dibis. Sadly, they also decided to fast from being alive. All your humble.
So the goldfish didn't make it, but you kind of fit a lot in there. I mean, you're making it very relatable. You're talking about peanut butter and jelly, but you're also talking about, religious rituals. You're talking about very different cultures. And in a subtle way, you're sort of making it all seem kind of lighthearted, but it's deeper than that.
Well, I appreciate the question. You're sort of getting into my everyday mind and how I'm thinking in this space. How do you take something that's so foreign and different that people don't have any exposure to, and make it relatable? And there's lots of ways that I've done that in different ways. In this case, there's nothing more relatable than peanut butter and jelly. But to understand, to me in my mind, having known Iraqis and cared about Iraqis and worked with them shoulder to shoulder for a long time, I know so much about them and their heart and their worldview that Americans don't have the privilege to know necessarily. So I'm constantly asking myself, what can I do to take this totally different world and make it accessible and understandable to people in another world? And that's the essence of what I'm trying to do.
And so if you go through your social media, you have done a lot of adventures. You've gone to all kinds of different cultural events. You've talked to dozens, if not hundreds of people and interviewed them. How have you been received?
It's overwhelmingly positive and constructive. And I don't think that's by accident. I think I'm conscious about the approach that I take. I do have a position. I'm not apolitical. I have a bias toward people being nice to each other and trying to understand each other better. That's
fair bias.
That's my politics in a nutshell. But I do take positions on things, but I do it in a way that acknowledges the validity of other points of view. And I don't suggest it as though this is how you should think, or this is the only way to see it. And I think that's a little different than a lot of what's on social media today. I think it's refreshing to people. They've told me that. And so I think that's a little bit about why it's been well received.
And so how do you come up with your next adventure? And how do you choose? I mean, you go to cultural events, you go to churches. You recently went on this bus trip that is kind of an exploration of Black history and sites of significance in the African-American community. How do you pick? How do you choose?
It's through relationships and frankly, what I have time for.
Yeah.
It's time is always against me, but in this case, the bus tour is an amazing tour of historical neighborhoods in Jacksonville to support Black-owned businesses. And the first time I went, I was the only white person on the bus, and that was an experience worth commenting on, and I did. But I did it in a way that showed that I don't know everything. I'm here to learn. I'm not colorblind. We're not colorless beings. I understand the context where all this is coming across. And I'm just trying to model curiosity and empathy about others, doing something that a person like me doesn't often do. And so that's sort of kind of the approach that I take, putting myself in somebody else's world and taking people along with me as a result.
Other than producing social media, what is your experience with social media? I mean, as you said, a lot that exists out there is not of this tenor. It is very different and sometimes in really troubling ways. So what is your own appetite for social media? What is your own consumption? And what is your, if anybody, what are you emulating?
Well, I see the same things that I think everybody does, and my anxiety goes up. I can feel my stomach turning in knots when we're talking about issues. And for me, it's what has driven me for a long time. It's worth stating for context. Is I by default, whenever I see people interacting in daily situations, maybe there's somebody standing next to somebody else in the supermarket. Maybe one person is, very particularly conservative person. Another person maybe not. But I can see that what connects us is so much more universal and common than the things that divide us. And I think the divisions that we imagine between ourselves that are reinforced on social media is largely artificial. And so I'm seeing kind of the divisive content on social media the same as everybody else. But so therefore, I think it's a good idea to try to take a different approach in it when I'm posting. But I'll also mention to your question, when I get comments, occasionally get nasty comments. I've been surprised that, nothing, I'm not inviting trolls, but, I haven't got a lot of those. But when I do, the way I respond is as if you're responding to somebody in real life. Because imagine that person that's commenting, sure, they have a username, they have a funny picture, but that's a person, just like you might meet in real life. And the way you respond to them, even if they've given you a bunch of ugliness hiding behind that anonymity on social media, there's an opportunity to turn that around. And I have to take a beat. It hits me in the gut when somebody says something negative or a personal attack or something like that. But I get in the habit of, I picture, water off a duck's back. I literally picture like just shake it off and don't even think about it. Maybe that's unhealthy compartmentalizing. I don't know, but that's how I do it. And then I respond kind of automatically. I try to validate something that's logical in their thinking. I try to acknowledge the little bit of their perspective. I don't attack back. And you would be surprised how many trolls I've turned into followers.
When you say you see two people that might come from very different perspectives, and you see that they have more alike, what do you see that they share that you think people should be thinking about instead of difference?
It's funny, from the conflict resolution world, they talk about positions and interests and needs, and positions are at the top, like the top of the iceberg that you see above the surface. We already know we disagree on the positions. That's obvious. But underneath the surface are our interests, and maybe they align, maybe they don't. But underneath that, deeper still, is our fundamental needs that's driving our interests that then determine our positions. And those almost always overlap. We want what's best for our kids. We want some sort of financial stability. We want the basic things that everybody does. And so that's what I have in my mind when I'm thinking about starting points for things. Then when the division comes for all sorts of reasons based on how we consume information, how we share information, how we form opinions. And I think that's where it becomes a little artificial.
So we alluded to the fact that next week is Thanksgiving. Is there anything that you've learned through your process that would be helpful or applicable to people heading into some dicey conversations?
Yes, I've talked about how to engage with people in a way that can make them less defensive, and it's a psychological thing. It's comes from research. I'm thinking of the work of Harville Hendricks in mirroring, validating, and empathizing, and it's basically paraphrasing what somebody has said in their own words. Not to make this clinical or weird or awkward. It should be in the course of a natural conversation, but say the words that they have said so that they know they've been heard. There's a psychological effect that happens. The reason people get their shoulders come forward and they sit up in their chair and they'll have a little aggressive, look on their face is because they feel their position, their view is not being heard. If they feel like you have heard what they've said, you can immediately see their shoulders relax. And the pushback I get on this is that, well, if somebody's objectively wrong, and I'm validating their objectively wrong view, that's not right. I can't do that. And my response to that, and what I would tell people is, if you want to win the argument, you have to win the person. Don't think about, put the issue itself aside for a moment. It's not going anywhere. This is a psychological human tactic to make a human brain less defensive. And then you have a better chance of sorting out that issue. So it's all about how you can, manipulate is too strong of a word, but use psychological techniques in order to make people less defensive and more open to hearing a different point of view.
Well, it's good advice, and it is really encouraging to see that the work that you're doing on social media has been so well received because it's fascinating topics that you're covering. It's important history, but it's also, I think, really good exercises for people to see you go through. So thanks for what you're doing. Tell people what your handle is. I mean, people can search for your name, John Filson, and find most of your platforms.
And it's Filson with an F like Frank. I say on the phone all the time, F like Frank, Ilson. Anyway, on Instagram, it's John, John _ Filson. On TikTok, it's just at John Filson. You can also find more information at johnfilson.com about what I'm all about.
All right, John Filson, it's so nice to meet you. Thanks for being here.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Up next, we talk to a bluegrass artist who's coming to St. Augustine later this week.
One Jacks presents its annual Interfaith Thanksgiving Gratitude Service, Thursday, November 20th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. at Palms Presbyterian Church, accepting donations of non-perishable food items to help others. Registration online at onejacks.org. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. When people are hurt through no fault of their own, finding the who, what, when, where, why, and how that led to the accident is critical to proving the truth.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.
On the next Fresh Air, dream scientist Michelle Carr. She runs a sleep lab where she studies people as they're dreaming with a focus on nightmares and lucid dreaming. She'll talk about her new book, Nightmare Obscura, and how she says we can change our recurring nightmares. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Mathematician Eugenia Chang wants people to reconsider how we think about equality. 2 times 3 may equal 3 times 2, she says, but what's equal can also be unequal.
It's really about seeing inequality as part of equality and that we draw a line in between them and the line can change. It's not in a strictly fixed place.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. Eugenia Chang reimagines the world with math. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Masked federal agents, unmarked vans, thousands of detainees disappearing from immigration and customs enforcement databases. Secrecy surrounds the Trump administration's mass deportation agenda. What do we know about conditions people experience in the system and the guardrails that exist to protect them? That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. The legacy of late folk great Gamble Rogers has been celebrated at an annual folk festival since 1995. But this year, organizers created a monthly series of concerts in his name, running from October to June. The Gamble Rogers Concert Series features a range of performers, from Richie Havens sideman Walter Parks to acclaimed folk punk musician Sonny War. We had a chance last week to sit down with featured singer-songwriter Jordan Tice ahead of his St. Augustine performance. Let's take a listen. Jordan Tice, thanks so much for being here today.
And it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you began playing music pretty early, and you come from a musical family, really kind of a mom that planted the flag for bluegrass pretty early in the world of women in bluegrass. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how you grew up around music.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of my folks are great bluegrass musicians, and my mom was actually a professional bluegrass musician back in the late 70s, early 80s, and played in the first all-female bluegrass band, the Buffalo Gals, based out of Syracuse, New York. And then kind of settled down and had a family, but there was always music around the house, and they were always playing local gigs on the weekend and having jam sessions and things. So it was a great environment to grow up in.
And so, this was a certain style of music. It sounds like initially when you began performing, when you kind of picked up the guitar, you weren't necessarily aiming to do bluegrass or even folk music. You were kind of in a different headspace then.
For sure, yeah. Was into rock and things that were on the radio, and then Got more into like jazz and bluegrass kind of later in my, maybe around the age of 16, 17, after going to a bluegrass festival.
And then you did some professional, I mean, you went to school for music, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, music composition.
Okay. And so, what were you listening to at that point in your life, growing up? What was formative other than sort of hearing the music around the house?
I mean, just kind of like everything. I feel like I've gone through a phase that basically has touched on any genre at any point. But at that point, I was really into maybe more guitar and composition kind of oriented music. I liked a lot of jazz, like Keith Jarrett and Pat Metheny and Miles Davis, as well as a lot of the people like Bela Fleck and Edgar Meyer and Chris Thile that were doing the kind of progressive instrumental bluegrass thing. But yeah, that's what I was into at that time. But since have gone through many other phases.
And you have done performing, bluegrass. You have performed alongside people, including Steve Martin, who we actually just talked last week to Allison Brown. And
Oh yeah.
But you've also been a part of this bluegrass supergroup, Hawtail, so which has been mostly, I think, instrumental music. Is that right?
That's correct.
And your own solo work early on has been a lot of instrumental music. So explain, if you can, just sort of what the appeal is of that, and then why you've shifted gears more recently to also having, vocal tracks in your releases.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? Almost concurrently with picking up a guitar for the first time came the impulse to write music. So as quick as I was learning how to play things on the guitar, I was also coming up with little riffs and little kind of guitar pieces that were quite simple at first, and then kind of developed from there. And it's really not until I moved to I've always loved songs and listened, like Bob Dylan has always probably been one of my very favorite musicians and other great songwriters. But it wasn't really until I moved to Nashville about 10 years ago that I got into songwriting. It's like something I always wanted to do, but couldn't really find my way in, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so we have a little clip of original song that you wrote for this EP called Mean Old World. Let's take a listen to it for a second.
The song as the mean old world marches on.
So a really lovely guitar playing there. Can you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind that song?
Yeah, it's kind of one of those songs that it's kind of hard to pinpoint to an exact situation. It's just kind of I was moving out of a house and just kind of had like one of those kind of feelings of nostalgia and just kind of life moving forward against your will, and just kind of putting an end to kind of an era of sorts. And yeah, just kind of maybe that sentiment. I feel like I was kind of living in that sentiment, and then that song came out.
Yeah, well, it's a very evocative and really beautiful song. So, what is it that you're going to be performing at your St. Augustine show? Is it going to be stuff off the new EP? Or are you going to be performing some of the instrumentals that you've done over the years as part of the group, or what should audiences expect?
Yeah, well, I will perform the new EP in its entirety. And I also should say that joining me for the show will be Paul Coert on bass, who's my bandmate in Hawtail. And he's just kind of played music on everything I've ever done, and one of my best friends. And he plays bass in the Punch Brothers and with Gillian Welch. So he's quite a esteemed bass player. So he'll be there. And he played on the EP. So we'll play the EP as well as things from my previous record, Motivational Speakeasy. And I should also mention that I'm currently deep in the throes of working on a brand new record that Paul's working on with me. So we'll be playing a bunch of new stuff as well.
Excellent. Well, Jordan Tice, he performs as part of the Gamble Rogers concert series on the 22nd on Saturday. It's at the St. Augustine Waterworks on San Marco Avenue in St. Augustine. And we've got a link on our website. Jordan Tice, it's so nice to meet you. Thanks so much for doing this.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's our program. Join us tomorrow when we talk about all the week's headlines with our Media Roundtable. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. WJCT Public Media is supported by the United Church UCC DOC and Quakers in St. Augustine, an open and affirming community rooted in social justice. More information at uccsa.org and staugustinequakers.org.